I'm pleased to speak about the historical records of the Hudsons Bay Company in relation to the early history of Alberta and Fort Edmonton in particular. There's wide recognition that the Hudsons Bay Company was a government before there was one in Western Canada, and that its business activities played a fundamental role in shaping and developing Canada as we know it today. So it's appropriate to explore the history of how the history of Fort Edmonton, the Hudsons Bay Company, and Canada are intrinsically linked. On the 19th of June 2007, it was announced that the records of the Hudsons Bay Company archives would be included in the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organizations, or we know it as UNESCO's, Memory of the World Registry. So this month marks the 10th anniversary of this international recognition. The Hudsons Bay Company was the first archives in Canada, along with the Quebec Seminary records, to receive this international recognition since the register was established in 1997. The name, the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England, trading into Hudsons Bay, is usually shortened to the Hudsons Bay Company, or even the Bay. This has the effect of limiting the Hudsons Bay Company to the original chartered territory of the Hudsons Bay drainage basin, known as Rupert's Land. While Rupert's Land, named after the Hudsons Bay Company's first governor, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, is an area equal in size to approximately 1/12 of the world's surface, or about 40% of modern Canada, it was and remains to this day one of the most sparsely inhabited regions of the globe. In 1670, the year the Hudsons Bay Company's charter was granted, the economic significance of Rupert's Land stemmed from the fact that, thanks to its cold climate, it produced large quantities of fur-bearing animals. Most desirable of these was the beaver, whose underfur could be felted and made it into durable, waterproof hats. How could supplying the market for hats lead to a company's history of international significance? The answer lies in looking at the name as a whole and realizing implications of England, trading, and Hudson's Bay. The intent of the stockholders, or adventurers, was to profit from bringing together Europe and America, the old world and the new, and filling the needs of both. This the Hudsons Bay Company did with such success and vigor that it helped create a modern global economy. Today we see eating foodstuffs or wearing clothing, which originated half the world away, as a modern phenomenon. Yet 2 centuries ago, in exchange for the furs they supplied, Indigenous people in the interior of North America could adorn their clothing with beads made from Bohemia and use tobacco grown in Brazil, shipped to Portugal, then to England and back across the Atlantic to the Bay. The Hudsons Bay Company's views stretched the horizons well beyond Rupert's Land. The fur trade took it to Hawaii, the Pacific coast, from Russian America to San Francisco Bay, and what are now the states of Montana, Idaho, and Utah. As their ships sailed to the Pacific around the Horn, they did what business they could do in South America. In the 1920s, the Hudsons Bay Company even attempted fur trading in the Russian Far East. The ability to think and act on a global scale, which the Hudsons Bay Company had cultivated in the fur trade, culminated during the First World War in the French government business. The Hudsons Bay Company acted as a chief shipping and purchasing agency for the governments of France, Belgium, Romania, and Russia, supplying these nations with raw materials and manufactured goods from all over the world. The political impact of the Hudsons Bay Company also had been significant. While it maintained its grip on its chartered territory for its corporate benefit, this had the side effect of keeping a large part of North America within the British Empire. When the British North American Act of 1867 created the Dominion of Canada, the transfer of Hudsons Bay Company territories, I'm going to move this. The transfer of Hudsons Bay Company territories in the north and the west of the new nation was already under consideration and ultimately took place in 1870. This was not the only way the Hudsons Bay Company helped create the boundaries of the modern Canadian nation. It was the Hudsons Bay Company in negotiations after the War of the Spanish Succession, which was 1709 to 1714, that had suggested the 49th parallel of latitude as the north-south boundary between their territory and the French, an idea Americans successfully promoted in the next century when the boundary between the U.S. and British possessions west of the Great Lakes was settled. The boundary between Canada and Newfoundland, or Quebec and Labrador after Newfoundland joined the Canadian Confederation in 1949, was determined in 1927 in part on the basis of Hudsons Bay Company maps. The boundary had been west-east boundaries between Rupert's Land and New France. In bringing together Britain and North America by the means of its trade, the Hudsons Bay Company had an effect on the people of both. The Hudsons Bay Company gave the British not just furs and hats and increased global power, it also enhanced their world knowledge through its support of exploration, mapping, and research. Geographical information supplied by Hudsons Bay Company mapmakers such as Peter Fiddler was added to the maps of North America published by the Arrowsmith firm of London. Books by Hudsons Bay Company employees or former employees such as Samuel Hearn, Edward Umperville, and R.M. Ballantyne helped create the British idea of North America. The Hudsons Bay Company also assisted botanist David Douglas and ecologist Charles Elton to carry out scientific research. The impact of the Hudsons Bay Company on Indigenous people of North America was profound. The fur trade established reliance on trade goods. For some peoples, especially those who lived close to the Hudson's Bay, it created a way of life centered around Hudson's Bay Company posts and marriage with Hudson's Bay Company men. The founding of the colony at the forks of the Red and Assiniboine Rivers, present-day Winnipeg, Manitoba, in 1812, with its farms, churches, and schools, pioneered the agricultural settlement in Western Canada. The changes that followed after Rupert's Land became part of Canada in 1870 with its waves of immigrants and an economy based on urbanization, commercial agriculture, and resource extraction have had more serious impact on Indigenous people of Canada than even the fur trade. The Hudson's Bay Company's involvement in urban retailing and sales of farm and town land made it an important factor in these changes. The Hudson's Bay Company, through its archives, has a significant role in the lives of Canadian Indigenous people today. The Hudson's Bay Company archives are acknowledged as a major source of written history for people often to have said have no written history. They are heavily used by researchers for land claims in Indigenous rights cases. I'm going to provide an example of one of those. Bert Horseman was a Cree living in northern Alberta, and he had been charged under the Wildlife Act for selling a grizzly bear skin. The act banned commercial hunting of this endangered species. He had killed the bear in self-defense when attacked by it while fur trapping. He sold the skin a year later because of difficult financial circumstances. Hudson's Bay Company archival records helped prove to the court that when local Native people signed Treaty 8, they had been making their livelihoods off the land, in part by commercial hunting. Post journals, account books, district reports, fur returns are some of the examples of the records that have provided important evidence for this and many other treaty rights cases over the course of the last 3 decades. The Hudson's Bay Company, the creation and preservation of the documents was inherent in the corporate life of the Hudson's Bay Company, resulting in a documentary record as full as possible of its activities over time. The Hudson's Bay Company's exemplary behavior in this regard is why such an enormous collection of records was amassed, providing a rich source that enables the study of the development of one company over a long period of time and its role in the development of Canada as a country. This, along with its multinational scope in carrying out its business activities over 3 centuries, makes its records internationally significant. So before I move along with an overview of the Hudson's Bay Company archives and focus discussion on the records relating to Fort Edmonton, I'd like to play a video clip that contains an interview with the former librarian and archivist of Canada, Ian Wilson. He sums up the national and international significance of the Hudson's Bay Company archives.
Well, the Hudson's Bay Company archives are, frankly, the national archives for a major part of Canada for a period of about 200 years, from 1670, the date of the charter, through to the time they surrendered the charter rights to the Crown in 1870. This is the National Archives because they held the full powers of the Crown, not just for trading, but for patenting land, for administering justice, for declaring war. They held the full rights of the Crown. I think it's seen as one of the great trading companies of the world that maintained an absolutely extraordinary record over several centuries. And I think for that, UNESCO has deemed it, along with other major documents internationally, from the Magna Carta to the Declaration of Independence to music scores of Mozart, as being part of the Memory of the World Heritage Register.
The winter of 1974 was one of discontent in the unions, and at one period we had heat for only 4 hours a day. I worked in winter boots and layers of woolen clothes. We lost no staff time. We simply regarded the situation as normal. Well, Winnipeggers, of course, had not seen anything like these 17th and 18th century documents, vellum covered and handmade papers. And I remember one day there were 30 researchers in the archives, and I was working. I was the only archivist on duty, and I went home that night, totally excited and totally exhausted.
Uses are as broad as your imagination can take you, anywhere from genealogical research for people who are descended from people that worked in the fur trade, to legal cases, to such things as they've been used quite extensively for native claims cases, for defending land and fishing rights and all kinds of rights cases. They've been used for environmental studies. The company kept meticulous records at various isolated posts over a long period of time. We're talking over 340 years of records that document day-to-day operations, and so you have detailed and extensive records of weather, and weather patterns over time, of sea ice, the presence of sea ice up in the north, because of the shipping records as well. People who are interested in astronomy and want to track an eclipse of the sun back then, it's hard to even describe how many different ways they are used. Shortly after moving its headquarters to Canada in 1970, the Hudsons Bay Company made the decision to move its archives to Canada as well. In 1974, the Hudsons Bay Company archives were transported across the Atlantic and deposited in the Archives of Manitoba. In 1994, the company made one of the most extraordinary public gifts ever and donated the company's records to the Archives of Manitoba. The appraised value of its archival treasure was nearly $60 million, but as we know, its intrinsic value is priceless. A foundation funded through the tax savings resulting from the donation was established. The revenue from the invested capital supports the operations of the Hudsons Bay Company archives in perpetuity. The extensive company archives include original handwritten journals, correspondence, accounts, maps, photographs, documentary art, film, and audio tapes, spanning from the inception of the company in 1670 to the present. Much of the textual records have been microfilmed and are accessible around the world through microfilm interlibrary loan. Descriptions of holdings and a limited number of digitized records are searchable through the Archives online database. In addition to the records of the Hudsons Bay Company, the Hudsons Bay Company Archives has a significant collection of private records, which includes records of related and subsidiary companies like the Northwest Company and of private individuals. The Hudsons Bay Company Archives has drawn people from all over the world to consult the resources, and many more have consulted the archives from a distance through correspondence, microfilm loan, and exhibitions. The historical, ethnographic, and cultural scientific significance of these archives has often made these voluminous records a focal point for research by students, teachers, historians, anthropologists, biologists, meteorologists, and genealogists, just to name a few. The use of the records is only limited by our imaginations and the questions that we ask of those records. James Isham's observations consist of 2 volumes written between 1742 and 1743, during a time when he was confined to Fort Prince of Wales due to illness. His observations deal with subjects such as Indigenous people and their language, natural history, life at fur trade posts, the country west of Churchill, and south of the Hayes River. His observations stress the importance of moving inland for commercial reasons. Philip Turner was one of the first full-time surveyors engaged by the Hudsons Bay Company, and in the autumn of 1790, he left Cumberland House in present-day Saskatchewan for the Athabasca country in Alberta. This Hudsons Bay Company calendar painting shows Mr. Turner taking an observation at the east end of Lake Athabasca in August of 1791, while his assistant Peter Fiddler takes notes. Peter Fiddler, who learned his trade from Philip Turner, was the most prolific of his contemporaries in gathering information about uncharted lands of the Canadian Northwest. His journals and sketch maps acknowledge the important role of Indigenous people in communicating indispensable geographical information through the course of his extensive travels. He left amongst his records hundreds of maps, detailed trip journals, and meteorological information that supported European penetration into the continental interior. These records inform his contemporaries and those studying these records today about the geography, environment, and Indigenous people of the Canadian Northwest. And I'm happy to tell you that all of his journals have been digitized and are available online. William Thomason was a native of Orkney and was hired as a laborer in 1760 and rose to become governor inland for the Hudsons Bay Company. He established the first Hudsons Bay Company post of Edmonton House in 1795 in opposition to the Northwest Company's Fort Augustus. This was in order to secure the trade of the Blackfeet and pagan groups of the area. In addition to trading, the building of York boats and making of pemmican were carried out at this fort. Also, coal obtained from the banks of Saskatchewan was used in the blacksmith's forge. Through the course of its operations, Fort Edmonton served as the headquarters of the Saskatchewan District and the Edmonton District. When the Hudsons Bay Company and the Northwest Company merged in 1821, the Hudsons Bay Company took over the Northwest Company post of Fort Augustus. In the 1850s, the Roman Catholic and Wesleyan Methodist missionaries began conducting services at the post, and a chapel was located within the stockade of Fort Edmonton. John Rowan joined the Northwest Company at age of 16 years old. His first post was at Fort Augustus in 1803. He served in and around that post for the next 10 years, and then earned a partnership with the Northwest Company in 1820. When the two rival fur trade companies united in 1821, he was promoted to chief trader and later chief factor of the Saskatchewan District, headquartered in Fort Edmonton. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography speaks to his able management of the Saskatchewan District headquarters and the strategic importance of that post for the 30 years he oversaw its operations. And I'm going to quote from the dictionary. In addition to its fur returns, Fort Edmonton was also an important center for provisions. Their native hunters traded buffalo meat, which provided hundreds of packs of pemmican each year. And Rowan developed a substantial farm producing wheat, barley, hay, and potatoes. Fort Edmonton also became a vital link in the Hudsons Bay Company's transcontinental transport system. It supplied not only York boats for navigation of the Saskatchewan River, but also pack horses for the transshipment of cargoes from the Columbia and Peace Rivers to Fort Assiniboine in Alberta on the Athabasca River. Every summer, Rowan supervised the passage of large Saskatchewan brigade out to Norway House and York Factory. Much of his success has been attributed to his tough but fair trade relations with Indigenous people. This Hudsons Bay Company calendar painting depicts a scene in which Rowan stemmed an attack by 200 Blackfoot that were moving towards him and his company. When one of the chiefs fortunately recognized him, they were profuse in their apologies and regrets for having frightened them. And this anecdote was actually found, this story was found in Milton Cheadle's book, The Northwest Passage by Land, and it was told by Sir George Simpson's piper, Colin Fraser, in 1863. John Rowan died suddenly at Fort Pitt in 1854. This plan of Fort Edmonton was drawn by Lieutenant Mervyn Vavasor in 1846. Lieutenant General Henry James Ware and Lieutenant Mervyn Vavasor were selected to go to the Oregon Territory to examine how the British territory on the Pacific coast might be defended in case of war with the United States. Plans and reports were submitted for Fort Carleton, Fort Pitt, Fort Edmonton, Fort Colville, Walla Walla, Vancouver, and Oregon City. Vavasor's report submitted with this plan provides a good physical description of the post along with an assessment of its effectiveness for military defense, which I'll quote from. The fort is placed on the top of a hill but is commanded by a rising ground about 50 yards to the rear. The buildings are of wood and enclosed by 15-foot pickets in pentagonal form with 4 small square towers containing 2 one-pounder iron guns. This is the largest post in the Saskatchewan and the last fort we visited on the east side of the mountain. And he goes on to say, the nature and construction of these forts are not calculated to make any defense except against Indians. Forts Carleton and Edmonton are both commanded in the rear by musket range. And from the dryness of the climate and the nature of the materials, they could easily be set on fire, nor have the inhabitants any means of extinguishing it, their sole dependence for water being the river in the vicinity. Artist Paul Kane spent the winter at Fort Edmonton in 1847-48. His original painting of Fort Edmonton is at the Royal Ontario Museum. In his book, Wanderings of an Artist Amongst the Indians of North America, he describes the fort as unequaled so far as any other post in the interior were concerned in comfort and interest. The courtyard of the fort was about 300 feet long by 210 feet wide. In the middle of the palisaded enclosure stood the big house built by Rowan and the official residence of the chief factor. A contingent of the Northwest Mounted Police, the forerunner of Canada's iconic Royal Canadian Mounted Police, arrived in Fort Edmonton in October of 1874 under the command of Colonel Jarvis. The Hudsons Bay Company provided accommodation for their barracks that first winter until they could build their own accommodations some 30 miles downriver. Richard Hardesty by this time was the chief factor in charge of the Upper Saskatchewan district. He was instructed by the Chief Commissioner James A. Graham to house the buildings that can be spared without interfering with the fur trade business there. They were provided with supplies, good houses, and stables. Under the terms of the Deed of Surrender in 1870, in which the Hudsons Bay Company surrendered their chartered rights of Rupert's Land to Canada, the Hudsons Bay Company was granted 1/20th of all the lands in the Fertile Belt, as well as 50,000 acres around company posts. The Fertile Belt was defined as an area bounded on the south by the American boundary, on the west by the Rocky Mountains, on the north by the North Branch of the Saskatchewan River, on the east by Lake Winnipeg and Lake of the Woods, and the waters connecting them. Some 140 meters of legal and financial records relating to the Hudsons Bay Company's management of its disposal of its lands have actually survived in the Hudsons Bay Company archives. This includes 1,500 maps and plans. In 1881, the Hudsons Bay Company subdivided some of its lands reserved at Edmonton into lots for sale. A total of 600 land lots were surveyed and sold at that time. Additional sales of lots continued after that, as shown in these two plans from 1889 and 1921. You see the plan on the left that shows the reserve in Fort Edmonton was 3,000 acres. And the plan on the right shows lots unsold as of the 30th of June 1921. So the red colored in portion are the lots that had yet to be sold. Most of the lots were actually sold well into the 20th century, not before that. A sales shop was built in 1890 in the town of Edmonton, about 1.5 miles from the fort. although the Hudsons Bay Company had been conducting retail trade out of its fur trade posts for a long time. Business continued to be brisk for the store during the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897-98. The establishment of Edmonton as the capital of the new province of Alberta in 1905 and the arrival of the Canadian Northern and Grand Trunk Railways in 1905 and 1910. The fur trade post at Edmonton was closed in 1915 and the old fort was demolished at that time. The Edmonton department store was built in 1905, occupying one full block on Jasper Avenue. It experienced several additions and expansions from 1911 to 1949. The minutes of the Canadian Committee on the 4th of March 1937 considered a draft report recommending a new building of the Edmonton store at that time. And I quote, "A new building was recommended because of the deterioration, age, and obsolescence of the numerous buildings patched together and used for the store. The political situation in Alberta and the upcoming civic elections were favorable, and there were rumors that Eaton's would be building." The new store opened in November of 1939. The building was divided into 3 sections, and as each section was knocked down and built up again, the other 2 were used as business as usual. The Hudsons Bay Company's 250th anniversary celebrations in 1920 were undertaken with much fanfare. The Hudsons Bay Company had pageants and parades in Winnipeg and other western provinces. It even commissioned the making of a film called Romance of the Far Fur Country so operations in the north could be represented in celebrations in the south. They sent a film crew on a 6-month film expedition in 1919 along the Labrador coast to the eastern Arctic coast, then to Hudsons Bay and James Bay and across the western provinces. The route included a trip up to Alberta as far north as Fort McMurray and Fort Chipewyan. The film premiered in Winnipeg on May 2nd, 1920, and was screened in major cities across Western Canada. They are going through their operations as they were at that time, and they were probably staging certain kinds of trading activities and things that were happening, but these were real people that lived and worked at those posts at that time.
Remember in the north they did have things like railways and motorized ships and so forth, so it stayed that way for a while.
We received this film footage from the British Film Institute in 2010. It had stayed in London because the company had donated the films to the British Film Institute. But we wrote and asked them if they would consider transferring them back to us, because we had all the records relating to the making of the film. The Royal Charter granted by Charles II of England on May 2nd, 1670 specified that the Hudsons Bay Company shall pay a rent of 2 elks and 2 beavers whenever British sovereign and their successors enter the territories of the Hudsons Bay Company granted under the Charter. There have been 4 such ceremonies that have taken place in Canada during royal visits. Although all 4 took place in Manitoba, which were in 1927, 1939, 1959, and 1970, there is an Alberta connection with one of the rent-paying ceremonies. The first one in 1927 took place at Winnipeg's Canadian Pacific Railway station near, since the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VIII, was on his way by train to Alberta where he owned a large cattle ranch. The last time the rent ceremony was paid was when the headquarters moved to Canada and the requirement was removed from the revised charter. So this photograph actually shows his ranch in High River, Alberta.
Is it still Crown land?
I don't know. It'd be interesting to find that out, right? In 1945, the Hudsons Bay Company was making preparations to mark its 150th anniversary of the establishment of Edmonton House. J. Chadwick Brooke, Secretary for the Governor and Committee of the Hudsons Bay Company in London, wrote to the Canadian Committee in Winnipeg on the 13th of July, 1944, and I'll quote, "We refer to your letter of this 13th of April, 1944. In accordance with your request, we have enclosed a list of our classified records relating to Edmonton House, the bulk of which is stored in the country for safe custody during the war, with some notes indicating their nature and scope. The board have agreed that if the war is over and the Atlantic crossing safe, any or all of these items referred to on the list could be sent to you, subject to consideration of any requirements of the Hudsons Bay Records Society in connection to the preparation of the material for its publications." So the Hudsons Bay Company actually did move many of their records out of London to protect them from the bombs during the Blitz of the Second World War. They were stored in the wine cellars of Governor Patrick Ashley Cooper's country estate, Hexton Manor. There are records in our holdings today that actually show evidence of mold as a result of them being stored in the wine cellars during that time. The reconstruction of Fort Edmonton began as a Canadian Centennial project in 1967. It was supported by the Rotary Clubs of Edmonton and the Fort Edmonton Foundation, as those of you from this great city will know. The reconstruction is set in 1846. It's based on the plan drawn by Mervyn Vavasor, which I showed you earlier in this presentation. The reconstruction project relied heavily on the physical descriptions of the posts that are found in the records of the Hudsons Bay Company archives relating to Fort Edmonton. J.R. Murray, who is the director of the Canadian Committee, and the Canadian Committee served as a liaison and advisory committee to the Hudsons Bay Company's London headquarters. He was on hand for the opening of Fort Edmonton Park. I'd like to quote from his speech on October 13th, 1970. He speaks to the value of the fort's reconstruction and in a few words sums up the Hudsons Bay Company's impact on the development of the Canadian West. And I quote, "We celebrate today the 175th anniversary of the founding of the community of this community with the opening of an ambitious new park, including a replica of Fort Edmonton. I am very pleased that the company which I represent was invited to participate in this project in association with the City of Edmonton and the 4 Edmonton Rotary Clubs. The role of the fur trade in the development of Western Canada is well known. Briefly, fur traders discovered and mapped the principal river routes across the interior of the continent. Fur traders established the first tiny European settlements. 3 of our provincial capitals, Winnipeg, Edmonton, and Victoria, were founded as fur trade forts. The fur trade, specifically the Hudsons Bay Company in the 19th century, stalled American expansion, preserved British North America, and made possible the creation of Canada as a confederation from sea to sea. And yet, despite of its profound influence on the history of our country, the physical traces of the fur trade have all but vanished from the landscape. The early fur trade forts were flimsy wooden stockades scattered across a vast wilderness. They have either been buried under steel and concrete of more advanced civilization or abandoned by their builders to be swallowed up by the encroachment of the surrounding forest. There are 3 principal exceptions: Fort Prince of Wales at Churchill, whose barren stone walls withstood the demolition charges of the French in 1782, has remained uninhabited since then. York Factory, the great depot of the 19th century, now stands abandoned and forlorn near the mouth of the Hayes River. Both are being preserved as National Historic Sites. Unfortunately, they are almost completely inaccessible to the public. It is only at Lower Fort Garry, Sir George Simpson's gracious stone fort on the banks of the Red River north of Winnipeg, that the present generations can see and enjoy an era of Canadian history as it once was. It is in this context, therefore, that the rebuilding of Fort Edmonton on a really accessible site takes on real significance for the people of Canada. The Hudsons Bay Company dealt with problems of operating over vast distances and a diversity of conditions through diligently recording information. Its records cover a broad spectrum of life, some of which have been highlighted for you this morning. Their continuity is unparalleled, allowing historians and researchers to check and compare positions and points of view from all ends of the corporate perspective of one company through the records of the London headquarters, North American regional headquarters, and isolated fur trade posts across North America. The study of the records relating to Fort Edmonton demonstrates this incredible dynamic and helps us understand its important place in the history of this great country we call Canada. Happy Sesquicentennial, everyone. And please come and visit us at the Hudsons Bay Company Archives if you ever happen to be in Winnipeg. Thank you.